and Munira.
Thank you. Well, like the other panellists, I have some anxieties or concerns about the role of the critic and the status of the critic today. And I do think the critic performs a very valuable public service to us who may not be specialists in a particular art form, in a particular form of literature or music, because they bring to our understanding a certain degree of expertise and authority that's been built up over the years. And as Ronan described it, this kind of ability to show us artworks or books or music in a new way, things that we might initially find unlikable, ugly, not having value. Critics can bring to us a different perspective and can show us why a particular work of art might be extraordinary. And by that I mean extraordinary, out of the ordinary. It might be something special about it that we may not have seen. And they have this ability because they bring years of learning, they bring experience and understanding of previous art forms, and they bring a degree of understanding of the technical skill that might be required to produce certain art forms. So, for example, we've heard about literature and music, but in visual arts, it's I think, much better, much easier to understand a lot of contemporary visual art by knowing the kinds of artists that they're having dialogues with. So, for instance, Damien Hirst, who is a controversial artist, lots of people don't understand why he's considered so great. I think you can understand Damien Hirst better by understanding the works of Francis Bacon. You can understand the Chapman brothers better by understanding the works of Goya. And artists and critics, I think, tend to exist in a kind of mutually helpful way, in that critics can communicate the work of artists better to the public and can show us what's beautiful about it. I don't think that critics are just experts. I don't think they just bring knowledge or expertise or technical skill. I think they also bring, to some extent, a ability to judge on the basis of ethical or even moral or political dimensions. So I think that they can make the public think about questions that artists might pose and bring them to the fore in a way that perhaps we weren't even initially aware of. So I think that they bring a broader kind of cultural or political perspective, or at least the greatest critics do. And that, to me, is a very important public service. Some people tend to blame the democratization of the media or the growth of the blogosphere, the internet, self-published opinion, if you like, for the death of the critic, or the devolution of critical opinion, so that now everybody can set up their own blog, everybody can publish their own opinion of an artwork, of a book or a piece of music, and that this somehow makes it much more complicated or difficult to find real sources of authority, because there's just so much opinion out there. And it's true that there's lots of opinion out there which is particularly bad, or it's not very well informed. There's also very good opinion out there which hasn't necessarily had other ways of reaching the public. I have to say I'm probably less worried in some ways about the growth of the blogosphere as a kind of technological revolution, because throughout periods of history, there have been moments where technology has expanded the space for critical discussion, or allowed critics who perhaps haven't been part of the public realm or the public discourse. So, for instance, the European avant-garde at the early 20th century found the use of magazines, of print, of posters, of manifestos and books to be able to discuss new kinds of art that were coming out that weren't going through the traditional arts establishment, the traditional form of the exhibition. And in doing so, they established a new kind of authority, a new kind of critical discourse about a very interesting cultural moment. And more recently in history, if you think about the kind of underground magazines of the 60s, magazines like Time Out magazine, which are now very well read and very mainstream, at the time in 1968 when Tony Elliott set Time Out magazine up, it was really looking at popular culture and interviewing musicians and artists which were not really in the mainstream. So I think that there's always been historically a very important role in this kind of dissenting opinion, and the capacity for technology and new kinds of cheap ways of accessing opinions to come out has been quite useful, and has allowed new types of expert or new types of authority to develop. And I think what's interesting about the blogosphere actually is the degree to which, almost spontaneously, there are new kinds of authoritative websites that have come into being. So if you think about Arts and Letters Daily, which I read quite regularly, it's not a single critic, but it is a kind of source where you can find the best writing for culture and ideas, and it's read by about 300,000 people a day. And it's extremely well established. And in a way, what people do in order to try and understand everything that's going on, they do have their favourite websites that they go to because they trust the judgment of the people who are compiling and editing, and they believe that they can see and they can spot good writing, and so what they find interesting, they tend to trust. My concern is less with the kind of growth of the blogosphere and the way in which criticism has almost become devolved there. And my concern is much greater in terms of institutional authority, and where institutions, which are supposed to, I suppose, in the abstract, embody the whole point of criticism, the whole point of expertise or considered critical cultural judgment. And it's institutions, I think, that in current society, which are the most ambivalent and the most uncomfortable about asserting authority. So where the public goes to the internet and looks for reviews and almost in a kind of spontaneous way self-regulates and comes up with its own forms of authority, I think the public crave authority and crave critics, really good critics. Institutions, which are supposed to, or traditionally, are the kind of sources of authority for culture, have become deeply ambivalent about admitting that they do precisely that. And I mean by institutions, universities, schools, museums, galleries. In these places, using words like authority, expertise, making value judgments has become increasingly difficult. And what you find is that there are instances where institutions try and tell the public or tell viewers, tell visitors, that, or tell students even, that their opinion is actually just as valid, it's just as important, and we don't want to impose our critical judgment or our expertise upon you. That's not to say that institutions don't make judgments, they certainly do. Major art galleries have curators that choose paintings and create exhibitions. Academics choose the books that they study and they write journal articles about them. So judgment happens, but I would argue that it happens in denial. It happens almost without any kind of confident self-assertion. So there's a kind of routine process of judgment that goes on in institutions, but it's almost like there's a kind of cultural disavowal of it. And you see this in various examples. My own academic research has been looking at how do you set up cultural institutions where there is no real strong sense of cultural value. And I looked and found various examples of museums professionals encouraging amateur interpretations of the objects in their collections, encouraging visitors to write their own stories about the things that they see. You see this in the way that teachers tell students that their interpretation of a book is very valid, and in fact, you know, it's a good thing to have an initial reading of it, and then that's a valid interpretation. You don't have to worry about reading the kind of the criticism that goes with it. You see this in the way that young people, particularly in art galleries, I find, are encouraged to develop creative responses to the art that they see, the paintings, the sculpture that they see, but not necessarily given the tools to understand the historical context or the aesthetic value of those works. And there is a trend, I think, particularly in visual arts education, to use the art object as a kind of prop for the young person's creative ego, but without any ability to learn what makes that artwork special in itself, without any critical distancing from the artwork. And I think that that's something that has developed and has grown as a kind of mainstream phenomenon in arts education. And one indication of that is actually the number of students who come out of school who go and study on art courses. And by art courses, I mean fine arts. They actually go and try and become artists. There's a phenomenal growth of students at undergraduate level trying to become artists. At the same time, there is a dwindling number of art students who go into art history courses or who will go and study music theory. So there's a lot of trying to become an artist or become creative, but very little appreciation of what it is to be critical and to treat these works as things in themselves. My concern, my serious concern about this is that it is leading to a generation of young people in particular who have grown up without any kind of understanding or any kind of confidence in the art that they do see. And I had I'll tell you a very short story about this. It was an example that really struck home to me, the problem with this tendency, which is as part of my research about a year ago, I went to a modern art gallery in London. I won't name which one, but I accompanied a tour group of young people from a school. They were about 10 or 11 years old, and there were about 15 of them. And they would be taken on a tour around the art gallery by one of the people from the education department, who was himself a very young arts graduate. He'd just come out of fine art school, and he was working in the education department as a kind of freelance arts educator. And we walked around the gallery with these 15 or so kids, and ended up in a room with the work by Edoardo Palazzi, and some of his collages from the 1940s and 50s, which are, I mean, they're quite difficult pieces of work to understand, especially for young kids, because they're collages, they're taken from magazine cuttings and newspaper cuttings and so on. And what the tour group leader decided to do was sit the kids down, give them lots of magazines from today, and ask them to make their own collages. And the kids sat round and cut out and ripped out bits of magazine and newspaper and started making their own collages in the style of Edoardo Palazzi. And this was meant to be stimulating their kind of creativity. After about 20 minutes or so, the kids get really bored and they start kind of looking around and getting distracted. And one of them, a very bright kid as it happens, puts his hand up and he says to the tour group leader, to this young artist with floppy hair and jeans, you can imagine the cliche young artist, and says, so if our work is just like his, why is his hanging on the wall and not mine? And you can see the look of terror in this educator's face, because he suddenly realized that he didn't know how to describe it. He didn't know how to say, the work that you see on this wall has value that your work doesn't. And it could be aesthetic value, it could be for its historical value as a historical aspect, it could be any number of reasons, but he couldn't, at that moment, explain to those kids why it was they were even in the gallery and what they were doing. Why aren't we why aren't we doing this in our school? Why are we here? What's the purpose of this institution? Who decides what goes up here? And those are really important questions that a young person should have the right to know. Young people in that particular instant walked out the gallery more confused, more cynical, more just more mystified, really, about what art was and why it was of value. And in fact, I've actually come to think that when I have children, I won't let them into an art gallery, into one of these tours, until I feel that I can take them round, or I'm confident that someone will take them round. Because the worry is that they end up with a more cynical view of what art is, and they become more sceptical about it. I think the problem is compounded by a particular failure of contemporary criticism, which is not something that the other panellists raised, but I think is quite important, which is that there is a phenomenon in contemporary visual criticism of very opaque and obscure language, highly theorized. I know that Ronan talks about this in his book, which is an excellent book, and I really recommend it. There is a phenomenon of art criticism which speaks to itself, and there is actually a sociological term for this kind of writing. It's called art bollocks. And anybody with a PhD in sociology, which I have, and you read this stuff, you know that it's bollocks, because even I can't understand it. So there must be something about it which you think is that, are they really being serious? Are they really speaking about something with substance? And you wonder if they genuinely are. And so I think that whole world of the industry of arts criticism has compounded the cynicism and the skepticism of the general public. And I just want to make one final point, which is that the public craves authority, and it does crave criticism. And you see this when you watch those Tim Marlowe programs on Sky Arts. They used to be on Channel 5. Phenomenally popular, because people do want to understand art. They think there's something there. Young people crave going on the X Factor to be completely torn apart, because unlike their teachers, they can trust the judgment of people who are willing to be critical of them, who are willing to say this is good and this is bad and this is why. I don't think their judgment is always correct on the X Factor, but the point is that there is a kind of need that people have, and I think that it has to be said that the critics themselves and the industry of art criticism is not always good at doing that public service. And even though I would defend the importance of the critic, I think it's also worth recognising that the critic today does not always live up to the expectation.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you to our whole panel.
This question on where does the authority come from, and I think that the authority of the critic is inextricably linked with the notion of cultural value, and that cultural value is not like other kinds of value. And one of the problems is that up until the recent decades, in in universities and academia, there was a sense that when you criticise a work of art, you are trying to understand its value as a work of art, not just in all sorts of other ways. And what's happened in the past 20, 30 years is the work of art becomes a door by which you see everything else. So you read a book or you analyse a painting because it will tell you about the historical context of that society or politics, or you use it as a kind of prop to something else. And that's done in the name of Marxism and social theory. Now, in fact, actually, Marx writes about the importance of cultural value, something that transcends its social and historical context. And in fact, there's a part in the Grundrisse where he talks about the Greeks, and he says that it's pretty straightforward. It's pretty easy to work out that the Greeks and their particular form of culture and drama was bound up with the form of social development. But what's really difficult, what puzzles us, is why do they still bring us artistic pleasure now? Why, in completely different material circumstances, in a completely different historical period, should these works have value? And that, to me, is partly the role of the critic, because there is something else of value in a work of art which you can't understand just in terms of who made it or what it, the kind of social relations embodied in it, although all those things are extremely important. And when you dismiss the idea of cultural value, when you say that artworks can't transcend their time when they're always about something else, the nature of the institution then becomes problematic. Because why would you put up a painting on a wall when really it's only social relations that mean that they end up there? It's just because white men in suits say that it's a value. And it really destroys our trust and our faith in the whole concept of cultural authority. So I think that it's partly a philosophical question about restoring this idea that expertise and authority matter, because there is cultural value which exists, and you have to understand what it is that makes something special. This comment about criticism as a crutch, and really what you should think about is your own engagement in the artwork. There was a very good discussion yesterday about music and the importance of listening to music, and whether there was such a thing as a cultured ear, and which led to the question of whether there's such a thing as an innocent ear. And Ivan Hewitt said very eloquently that there is no such thing as an innocent ear. You don't come to things with just your own engagement, kind of without any sort of baggage, any influences, any kind of critical understanding. You always come to things with a certain perception or viewpoint. The point is that your view of things change, and they change the more that you know about something. So I'm not a professional critic, and I'm not particularly professionally involved in the arts except through policy. My background is I studied literature, but I have no training in visual arts. But I've come to like the visual arts because I've read criticism, and because it's helped me look at things in a different way. And in fact, it's stimulated an engagement which I didn't have previously. But the reason that I did it was because I have friends who were interested in the visual arts and who convinced me that there was something in it. So I think that this idea is rather naive, that there is an innocent ear or there is an innocent eye, and that the public is somehow being disempowered by not being allowed to use its own judgment. I do think it works the other way around, which is why I said I was quite positive about the blogosphere. I think that often there is expert amateur opinion where people see things in a different way. I am a former amateur blogger on Culture Wars, and I used to write critical reviews of plays at the Edinburgh Festival. And it was not only a great creative experience for me, but it did actually, I hope, help people who read it. And they found it stimulating, but also the people who created that work. So I don't think that what I'm saying is actually to disempower the public. It's part of a kind of critical discourse that should happen in a public realm. It's part of a public culture and an intellectual culture. And in that sense, I can't see why it would be a problem to receive opinion, why it should be oppressive or damage your own perspective of something. If anything, it should enhance it and help it. I think there are bad critics out there, and I think there are charlatans, and there are people who make things up or don't know enough. So I take the point that critics individually can not be up to scratch. I also should have made the point more clearly at the beginning, which is that experts or critics with expertise and with a degree of cultural authority can also strongly disagree with each other. And I like the point about the battle of ideas that, for instance, if you look at the Anthony Gormley work on the Fourth Plinth, which has just finished, which was about replacing the concept of the kind of solid statue, the solid memorial, with living people, there were I can name at least 2 critics who strongly diverged in their view on that. One of them thought it was fantastic and really revolutionary, and extremely experienced art historian. Another very experienced art historian thought it was crap and really terrible. And they were bringing to their understanding of that artwork not just years of knowledge and familiarity with other forms, but they were bringing a certain ethical value judgment or a political judgment. And I think that that's where sometimes critics do diverge from public reaction. And I think that there are critics who I just don't like. And there are things about contemporary visual arts and literature that I don't like because I don't like what they say and I don't like the answers that they come up with. But the point about critics as a concept or as a kind of, almost as an institution in themselves, is that what they say is that there are certain things that should have value, and we are arguing over what has value, what's of merit. And to let go of that idea, to say that everyone's opinion matters, is to effectively let go of cultural value itself. You're effectively saying that, well, it's all good. I get very worried, actually. There was in the debate again yesterday about music, when people say, well, as long as you're teaching music, it doesn't matter what kind of music, what kind of literature, as long as you're teaching them how to listen or how to be critical, then that's the important thing. Actually, I would like my kids to learn, the best that's been thought and said. And I think I would like to learn the best that's been thought and said. I had a very poor education when it comes to the arts and music, and I kind of feel like I would like to make up for it. And you need expertise and authority to help you do that. And so someone somewhere is making a value judgment, but it's not fixed. It's not set in stone. You can argue against it. We're not victims as the members of the public. We are, critical thinkers ourselves. But I think, unless you accept that someone somewhere is making a judgment and you want to contest it or you want to test it yourself, then how could you have any dialogue or any judgment about works of art?